This is Capital Secrets, and what you're about to hear is not really a story about statues, it's a story about power, about systems, about how a government learned to turn millions of ordinary lives into one enormous machine, capable of building an empire underground for a man who was already dead. Most people look at the Terracotta Army and see mystery, ancient warriors frozen in time, rows of clay soldiers standing silently beneath the earth. But the real story is far darker and far more modern than it first appears. Because the Terracotta Army was never just art. It was economics. It was state power made visible, and hidden beneath those statues is one of the oldest lessons in history. The moment a government becomes good at measuring society, it also becomes good at controlling it. To understand how this happened, we need to go back before there was an empire at all. Long before China was unified, the land was divided between rival kingdoms locked in constant warfare. These states fought endlessly for land, grain, manpower, and survival. And in that brutal environment, one kingdom slowly became different from the others: Qin. While rival states still depended heavily on noble families and older feudal traditions, Qin became colder, more disciplined, more administrative. Its rulers understood something powerful. Victory was not just about stronger armies, it was about stronger systems. The Qin state began carefully counting households, tracking land, measuring production, organizing labor, courting obligations, and rewarding military achievement with ruthless efficiency. In simple terms, Qin became better at turning society into data, and once a state can clearly measure society, it can extract more from it. That was the real revolution, not military strength alone. Administrative control. The rulers of Qin weakened old aristocratic families and redirected loyalty toward the state itself. Law became strict, punishments became severe. The government expanded deeper into everyday life. Farmers were registered, taxes became easier to collect, men became easier to conscript, resources became easier to move. Qin was learning how to centralize power on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. And eventually, that system conquered everyone else. In 221 BC, the king of Qin unified the rival states and declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. But conquering territory was only the beginning. Holding it together was much harder. An empire does not survive through symbolism alone. It survives through systems. Roads, taxes, labor, administration, standardization. This is where the Terracotta Army truly begins. Because the army was not financed by wealth in the modern sense. It was financed through extraction. Grain financed it, labor financed it, taxes financed it, human lives financed it. And that changes the way you see those statues forever. The Terracotta Army was part of an enormous mausoleum complex built for the first emperor. But calling it a tomb almost understates the scale. It was an underground empire. Soldiers, officials, horses, weapons. Entire logistical worlds recreated beneath the earth. The message was unmistakable. Even death would not interrupt imperial power. But beneath that grand vision, something darker was happening. Fields were being taxed. Workers were being mobilized. Families were losing sons to labor projects. Entire communities were being pulled into the machinery of the state. The Terracotta Army looked immortal. But the system financing it depended completely on exhausting the living. Ancient accounts describe huge labor forces working on imperial construction projects for years. Whether the exact numbers were accurate is almost beside the point. The scale itself tells the story. Only a government with extraordinary reach could coordinate something this large. Think about what that required. Food had to be transported. Clay had to be mined. Weapons had to be forged. Roads had to function. Workers had to be supervised. Supplies had to move constantly across enormous distances. This was not random construction, it was centralized organization, nearly 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. And that's what makes the Terracotta Army so important economically. It reveals an early empire discovering the power of coordination. The statues themselves were only the visible result. The real achievement was the system underneath them. Qin standardized writing, standardized measurements, standardized coinage, standardized transportation systems. At first glance, that sounds practical, and in many ways it was. Trade became easier. Communication improved, administration became more efficient. But standardization also has another effect. It increases visibility. And once society becomes easier to measure, it also becomes easier to control. That is one of the oldest hidden truths of political power. Every empire wants legibility. Every empire wants systems that reduce friction, because when friction disappears, resources move faster toward the center. Taxes become easier to calculate. Labor becomes easier to mobilize. Production becomes easier to coordinate, and resistance becomes harder to hide. The Terracotta Army was not built because Qin society casually had extra resources to spend on art. It was built because the empire became extremely efficient at concentrating resources into a handful of massive state priorities. That is a very modern pattern. Even today, large governments and large institutions operate the same way. Millions of small obligations compressed into gigantic centralized projects. And the people financing them often barely understand the scale of what they are supporting. But the Qin system had another advantage: fear. The empire became famous for harsh law and severe punishments. Corvée labor obligations forced people into public projects. Convicts could be sent into state construction systems. Entire populations could be mobilized through coercion. That meant the empire could lower costs in ways modern economies usually cannot. Not through innovation alone, but through command. This is another recurring pattern in economic history. What appears astonishingly efficient from above often depends on someone below losing the freedom to refuse. The Terracotta Army is beautiful, but the beauty cannot be separated from the coercive system that created it. Every statue represents skilled labor, organization, planning, coordination, but also extraction, pressure, fear, and state control. The army itself reveals how advanced the Qin administrative machine had become. These were not identical statues mass-produced without thought. Bodies could be created in modular ways, then refined with distinct features and ranks. Weapons were produced with remarkable consistency. Workshops coordinated clay, bronze, timber, firing, assembly, and transport. This was effectively a state-managed production ecosystem. Mass coordination, specialization, centralized control, standardized systems. The tomb was not simply a monument. It was proof that the empire had learned how to organize human effort at enormous scale. And for a while, that system looked unstoppable. The Qin Empire built roads, expanded infrastructure, standardized the economy, and projected power across vast territory. But history hides a dangerous pattern inside systems like this. The stronger centralized systems become, the more they risk confusing capacity with wisdom. Because a government that can build enormous things often begins believing it should build enormous things. A government that can command more begins commanding more. A government that can extract more begins extracting more. And eventually, the burden underneath the system starts growing faster than the system itself. For the emperor, standardization looked like order. For ordinary families, it often looked like intrusion. For the court, the mausoleum represented eternal glory. For workers, it represented exhaustion. This is one of the oldest lessons in financial history. A system can become extremely effective at extraction without becoming durable. In fact, excessive extraction often destroys durability, because people obey differently when they feel governed than when they feel harvested. And the Qin Empire eventually discovered that reality the hard way. Despite all its power, despite its military success, despite its administrative sophistication, the dynasty collapsed astonishingly fast after the first emperor died. Rebellions spread. The imperial system fractured. The state that built one of the greatest construction projects in human history could not secure its own future for long. That collapse matters because it reveals the weakness hidden inside highly centralized systems. They often appear invincible, right before they become fragile. The more concentrated power becomes, the more dependent the structure becomes on stability at the center. And when the center shakes, everything shakes with it. The Terracotta Army survived, but the dynasty that built it did not. That contrast is the real warning buried beneath the earth. The statues symbolize permanence. The empire behind them proved temporary. And maybe that is the deeper lesson hidden inside nearly every great monument in history. Massive monuments are not always proof of civilizational health. Sometimes they are proof of concentrated authority. Proof that a government became powerful enough to redirect enormous amounts of human effort towards symbolic goals. And modern societies are not as different from Qin as we often imagine. Modern governments no longer conscript peasants into tomb construction, but they still rely on visibility, measurement, compliance, standardization, data, taxation, administrative reach. The methods changed, the logic did not. Large systems still depend on the ability to make society measurable, because once society becomes measurable, it becomes easier to reorganize around priorities chosen far above ordinary people. That can create enormous benefits: infrastructure, trade, coordination, economic growth. But it can also create overreach, vanity projects, administrative bloat, and systems so focused on expansion that they slowly exhaust the people underneath them. The Terracotta Army forces you to ask a question that still matters today. At what point does organization become control? At what point does efficiency become extraction? And at what point does a system become so powerful that it stops understanding the limits of its own power? Because history is full of governments that believed administrative strength alone could guarantee permanence. And history keeps delivering the same answer. Power can build astonishing things, but power alone does not create stability. The Terracotta Army is not just an archaeological wonder. It is a reminder that behind every great monument, there is usually a hidden system moving resources, labor, and human lives toward the ambitions of the center. The statues are impressive, but the real wonder and the real warning was the machine that made them possible. If you want to understand the hidden systems behind money, power, and civilization, subscribe to Capital Secrets, because the biggest forces shaping history are usually not the things people notice first. They are the systems operating quietly underneath everything else.